When my wife walked into the living room that evening, there was a spring in her step I hadn't seen in weeks. She'd quit her last job 2 weeks ago, fed up with the toxic atmosphere and an incompetent boss who made everything worse. I'd been quietly waiting for her to figure things out, but this time she came in with a smile and announced, "I found a new job." It caught me off guard. She hadn't been actively searching, at least not that I'd noticed. I set my book down and asked, "How'd you manage that? You haven't even opened any job sites." She explained that an old friend of hers had reached out after seeing one of her Instagram stories. Apparently, the company he worked for had an open position because someone was going on maternity leave. He thought of me and offered to help, she said casually, as though this sort of thing happened every day. I wasn't entirely sold on the idea of jobs falling into people's laps through social media, but I kept my skepticism to myself for now. "So when do you start?" I asked. "Not so fast," she replied, taking a seat across from me. "First, I need to meet with him to go over the details. It's more of an informal meeting than anything else." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "But I'm going to need your help with something," she added. That got my attention. "How exactly am I supposed to help?" I asked, already calculating what this might involve. She smiled and said, "I need you to choose the best place for us to meet. Somewhere impressive. You know, a place that says we're not just some ordinary people." I raised an eyebrow. I wasn't sure why this meeting required such theatrics, but I didn't argue. "All right," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I'll pick a spot that leaves no doubts." I spent some time thinking it over, going through a mental list of restaurants we'd visited over the years. There were plenty of decent options, but I wanted something that would make an impression. After some deliberation, I settled on one of the fancier spots downtown. It wasn't a place we went often, too expensive for casual outings, but it fit the bill for what she wanted. When I told her about my choice, she looked pleased. "That's perfect," she said. She made the call to her friend right then and there, setting things in motion. I listened as she confirmed the details, her tone cheerful and confident. "He's good with the restaurant," she said after hanging up. "We're meeting tomorrow at 6 in the evening." I nodded in acknowledgement. Everything seemed straightforward enough for now, but I made a mental note to keep an eye on how this played out. The next step was making sure everything was ready for the meeting. She started talking about what she might wear, while I kept my focus on ensuring the restaurant reservation was locked in. This wasn't just about her job, after all. It was also about making the right impression on her friend, on the potential employers, and anyone else involved. As far as I was concerned, there was no room for half measures. By the time we finished our respective preparations, the plan was solid. The restaurant was booked, her outfit was chosen, and the details were finalized. Now, it was just a matter of showing up and seeing how it all unfolded. As she went to bed that night, I sat in the living room for a while, thinking about the meeting. If nothing else, I'd made sure we were putting our best foot forward. Whatever came next would depend on how the discussion went tomorrow. We arrived at the restaurant right on time, and my wife had gone all out with her outfit. It looked like she was about to walk a fashion runway. Her dress was sharp, her makeup impeccable, and her confidence practically radiated from her. As we stepped inside, I felt the usual hum of a busy evening at a high-end place like this. People were engrossed in their meals and conversations, waiters moved quickly yet gracefully, and the low murmur of voices filled the air. My wife scanned the room, and then she waved toward a group seated near the back. I followed her gaze to see 3 men in suits and 1 woman sitting together. They stood out, not because they were loud or ostentatious, but because they had that polished, businesslike demeanor that demanded a second look. My wife and I walked over, and I paid close attention to each person as we approached. One of the men, I assumed, was her friend. He wasn't the type to command attention, quiet and reserved, more of a listener than a talker. Then there was another man who seemed like he might be an assistant or second in command, and finally, the bald one. He didn't have to say a word for it to be obvious he was in charge. His posture, the way he scanned the room, and how the others seemed to defer to him made it clear. The woman next to him, holding his hand, was likely his wife. Introductions were brief and formal. My wife's friend greeted us politely, though without much enthusiasm, while the bald man, the boss, gave a firm handshake and a confident smile. His wife nodded in acknowledgement, and the other man simply said hello with a small smile. We all sat down, and I let the initial pleasantries flow. I asked a few casual questions about their company, the industry, and general interests. It was an easy way to break the ice and make sure the atmosphere stayed comfortable. They talked about the company's focus on lifestyle branding, and I noticed the assistant doing most of the explaining. As the conversation went on, I could tell the boss had his eye on my wife. He wasn't overt about it, but the way he glanced at her and the occasional compliment he threw in didn't go unnoticed. "That's a sharp dress," he said at one point, his tone light but deliberate. His wife didn't seem to care. She was busy looking at her phone or chatting with the assistant. I decided to keep my observations to myself for now, though I made a mental note of the interactions. When there was a slight lull in the conversation, I nudged my wife under the table. It was my signal for her to start talking business. She took the cue and began asking about the job's responsibilities, hours, and expectations. The assistant handled most of the answers, explaining the role in detail and addressing any questions she had. He seemed professional and competent, which was reassuring. Meanwhile, the boss chimed in occasionally, usually to add a compliment or to emphasize how the company valued someone with her skill set. "We're always on the lookout for someone who can represent us well," he said at one point, his eyes lingering on her just a little too long. "Someone like your wife could easily be the face of the company." He chuckled as he said it, but the comment wasn't entirely in jest. His wife didn't react, still seemingly indifferent to the conversation. My wife thanked him politely and kept the focus on work-related questions, clearly determined to steer things in a professional direction. As the discussion wrapped up, the assistant pulled out a business card and handed it to my wife. "If you have any questions before Monday, feel free to call me," he said. Then, almost as if to one-up his subordinate, the boss took a piece of paper, jotted down his personal number, and slid it across the table. "Call me directly if you need anything," he said, flashing another smile. "From Monday on, you're officially on the team." When we got back home, I took off my jacket and leaned against the counter while my wife went to check her messages. I waited for the right moment before bringing up what had been on my mind since the meeting. "Didn't you find his behavior a little odd?" I asked. She looked at me, puzzled. "What do you mean?" I shrugged and kept my tone neutral. "He seemed to bypass his assistant a lot. Gave you compliments that felt unnecessary. If his wife hadn't been there, I might have told him exactly what I thought about it. But since this was your informal interview, I held back. You're lucky it didn't get awkward." She sighed, waving it off like it was nothing. "I think it was just a psychological tactic," she said. "He probably wanted to make sure I felt welcome and committed to the role. Maybe they're desperate to fill the position if the previous employee went on maternity leave unexpectedly." Her explanation was plausible enough, though I still didn't like the way he'd acted. I let it go for the moment but made a mental note to keep observing as things developed. "It's fine," she continued, brushing past the subject. "The important thing is that I got the job. You don't need to worry about it." She gave me a reassuring smile, but it didn't erase the unease I felt. Still, I nodded and let her move on, figuring there was no point in arguing over it now. A little later, as she was tidying up, I decided to call her old friend who'd helped her get the job. It seemed only right to thank him for stepping in and connecting her with this opportunity. The call was brief but friendly. I let him know we appreciated his effort, and he laughed it off, saying it was no trouble at all. "She's a good fit for the role," he said. "They're lucky to have her." As the conversation turned casual, I brought up the boss and his involvement in the hiring process. "You've worked there a while, right?" I asked. "What's he like?" The friend hesitated for a second before answering. "He's hands-on," he said diplomatically. "Takes a lot of interest in his employees. Likes to be involved in the details. It wasn't exactly reassuring, but I didn't press further. He went on to mention something that caught my attention. If there's one downside to the job, it's the frequent business trips. The boss likes sending people on assignments, and he often goes with them. It's part of his whole hands-on approach, I guess. But yeah, you might find yourself missing your wife every now and then. That last comment lingered in my mind even after we said goodbye and ended the call. I sat back and thought about what he'd said. Frequent travel wasn't unusual for certain jobs, but the idea of her boss tagging along on these trips didn't sit right with me. Still, there wasn't much I could do about it now. The job was hers, and I'd have to see how things unfolded. For now, I let it rest, determined to keep an eye on the situation as it developed. The evening wrapped up uneventfully after that. My wife was in good spirits, and I didn't want to dampen her mood by dwelling on my concerns. But deep down, I knew I'd be paying close attention to how things progressed at her new workplace. If there were any red flags, I intended to catch them early. When my wife came home after her first day at the new job, she seemed in high spirits. She dropped her bag by the door, kicked off her shoes, and headed straight to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. "The team is amazing," she started, her voice full of enthusiasm. "I've already made 2 new friends. We've even planned to go for coffee after work tomorrow." She paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. I leaned back in my chair and listened as she went on about how welcoming everyone was and how the day had exceeded her expectations. Her energy was infectious, but I stayed reserved, wanting to hear everything before reacting. As she settled into the chair across from me, she added, "You'll never guess what happened. The boss spent the entire day personally training me." That got my attention. "The whole day?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is that normal?" She shrugged, still smiling. I thought it was, but when I mentioned it to the girls, they said he's never done that with anyone else. They even joked that he might have a little crush on me. Her tone was light-hearted, but I didn't share her amusement. The thought of her boss giving her special treatment didn't sit well with me. I put my drink down and looked her in the eye. "He's married," I said firmly. "And you realize if he ever crosses a line, I'll make sure he regrets it. You won't be working there if things get inappropriate." My tone was serious, but I wasn't yelling or overreacting. I wanted to make my stance clear without turning it into a fight. She sighed and leaned back, clearly not thrilled with my reaction. "I've barely started," she said. "Can we not jump to conclusions?" "I'm just trying to settle in." "I'm not jumping to conclusions," I replied. "I'm just making it clear where I stand. If he's already giving you this much attention, I'm going to keep an eye on it. That's all." She rolled her eyes, but didn't argue further. She knew me well enough to understand that I wasn't the type to let things slide if they seemed off. Still, I could tell she didn't want this conversation to overshadow her excitement about the new job. "Anyway," she said, changing the subject, "I've been thinking about trying to get to know his wife better. It's a little odd that she works alongside us instead of being in a higher position. You'd think she'd have a leadership role, considering she's married to the boss." Her observation was interesting, and I had to admit I'd wondered about that myself. "Maybe she prefers to keep things professional," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. "Or maybe he doesn't believe in favoritism," she added. "If that's the case, I respect him for it." I nodded, conceding that point. "That's probably the only thing I like about him so far," I said. "At least he's not putting his wife in a position she doesn't deserve. But let's keep an eye on things, all right?" She agreed with a slight nod, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics as we moved on with the evening. Still, in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that her boss's behavior warranted closer attention. The next evening, I was surprised to hear the front door open and the sound of my wife chatting with someone else. She walked in, not alone this time, but with the boss's wife. They seemed to be in good spirits, laughing as they carried a bottle of wine to the kitchen. "She wanted to stop by," my wife said, looking at me with a smile. I gave a polite nod and observed as they poured themselves glasses and settled into the living room. The two of them chatted away, talking about various things, life, work, and bits about their families. I stayed mostly quiet, sitting nearby and listening while pretending to be focused on my phone. The boss's wife was pleasant enough, sharing little anecdotes about their life and some stories about the company. She didn't seem guarded or overly formal, which was a little unexpected. My wife appeared to be enjoying the conversation, occasionally throwing in her own stories about her first few days at work. The atmosphere was light, but I stayed alert, especially when the talk shifted toward their husbands. They'd been at it for about an hour when I heard a car pull up outside. Moments later, the doorbell rang, and my wife got up to answer it. It was the boss himself, coming to pick up his wife. He stepped inside briefly, shaking my hand firmly and offering a polite smile. His demeanor was calm and collected, as usual, but I wasn't about to let the moment pass without learning something new. As he turned to my wife, he mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. "We might need her to go on a trip soon," he said, referring to my wife. "There's an important conference coming up, and I'll likely go with her to make sure everything goes smoothly." I didn't let the statement hang in the air for long. "Do you usually travel with employees?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral but direct. His response was quick and measured. "Not always," he said. "But for these kinds of trips, it's usually necessary, especially with the women on the team." I raised an eyebrow, prompting him to elaborate. "You see, at these conferences, there's often a lot of pressure," he explained. "It's not uncommon for competitors to try and intimidate or undermine our staff, particularly the women. Having a strong presence there can make all the difference. I'm there to provide that support, to make sure things don't get out of hand." The way he framed it sounded professional enough, but I wasn't entirely convinced. He continued, lowering his voice slightly as if sharing a secret. "In our industry, appearances matter a lot. People notice who's there, who's representing the company, and how they handle themselves. Unfortunately, some of these companies see female employees as easier targets. That's why I make it a point to accompany them on these trips, especially for big meetings. You could say it's about ensuring they're taken seriously." I nodded, processing his words. On the surface, his reasoning made sense, but something about his explanation still felt off. Whether it was his tone or the way he chose his words, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. My wife, meanwhile, seemed unfazed, nodding along as if this was perfectly normal. I stayed quiet, not wanting to escalate anything in the moment but filing the information away for later. As the conversation wrapped up, he offered another firm handshake and thanked us for hosting his wife. "I'll let you know more details about the trip once we finalize everything," he said, addressing my wife. I simply nodded and said, "Interesting," letting the word hang in the air. With that, they left, and the house fell quiet again. I sat back, thinking about the evening and everything that had been said. There was definitely more to this situation than met the eye. The morning of the trip, my wife was bustling around the house, making final preparations. Her suitcase was neatly packed, and she double-checked everything before zipping it up. "The boss and his wife will be here soon to pick me up," she said, pausing for a moment to look at me. I leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "Just remember what I said," I told her firmly. "Keep me updated. Every couple of hours, at least. You know how I feel about this." She rolled her eyes with a small smile. "You're being overly cautious. It's just 3 days, and it'll give us a little break from each other. Nothing to worry about." "I'm not worried about us," I shot back. "It's him." The way he explained his reasoning for tagging along sounded off to me. "Just keep your phone handy and don't forget to check in." She sighed but nodded, knowing better than to argue further. Moments later, we heard a car horn outside. She grabbed her suitcase, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "See you in 3 days," before heading out the door. I watched from the window as she climbed into the car. The boss was in the driver's seat, and his wife sat next to him. My wife waved as they pulled away, and I stood there for a moment longer before turning back to the empty house. It was the first time in a while we'd be apart, and though I trusted her, the circumstances still felt strange. Shaking my head, I decided not to dwell on it too much. There was work to be done, and I wasn't about to waste my day overthinking. The first few hours were uneventful. She sent me a couple of texts letting me know they'd arrived at the hotel and that everything was fine. But as the day turned into evening, the updates became less frequent. I shot her a message, asking how things were going, but didn't get a response right away. When I called, it went to voicemail. Finally, hours later, she texted back, saying she'd been in a crucial meeting and couldn't step away. "It's really important," she wrote. "I'll call you later." It wasn't the response I was hoping for, but I let it slide. I reminded myself that these trips could be intense, especially for someone new to the job. Still, when she mentioned the meeting had gone late into the evening, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of business was being conducted at 9 p.m. I shook off the thought and decided to wait until she was back to ask more questions. It wasn't worth starting an argument over the phone. When she finally returned home, it was clear the trip had gone well. She walked in with an energized demeanor, practically glowing as she recounted everything that had happened. "We made some incredible progress," she said, setting her suitcase aside. "The boss even drove me back. He's really something else." I raised an eyebrow but let her continue. According to her, they'd met with influential people, and she'd played a significant role in pitching a new startup idea. It was stressful, she admitted, but he stepped in when things got heated and totally shut down one of the more aggressive guys in the room. She seemed genuinely impressed by how he handled the situation. "He's got such a strong presence," she said. "When things started to spiral, he kept his cool and made sure I had the support I needed. I couldn't have done it without him." Her praise made me uneasy, though I didn't let it show. I nodded along, asking a few questions about the project to keep the conversation going. As the evening wore on, we shifted to more casual topics. She talked about some of the people she'd met and shared a few funny moments from the trip. I kept my responses measured, not wanting to ruin her good mood with my lingering doubts. By the time we headed to bed, she seemed completely relaxed, and I decided to leave any deeper questions for another time. For now, I was just glad to have her back home. The morning started like any other. We both woke up around the same time, though my wife headed to the shower first while I stayed behind in bed, scrolling through my phone. As I got up to grab a cup of coffee, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Over the years, we'd never been secretive about these things, and I knew her passcode. Curious, I picked it up, thinking it might be a message from one of her new work friends. What I saw instead caught me off guard. The message was from a group chat, and the conversation seemed lively. The names in the chat included her boss and a few coworkers, even the friend who had helped her get the job. They were talking about the recent trip, but something about the tone of the messages felt off. As I scrolled up, one comment jumped out at me. Someone had mentioned a big hole in a way that didn't make sense. My first reaction was confusion, but as I read further, the conversation became clearer and more inappropriate. One of them brought up a red dress with a plunging neckline, saying how incredible it looked. Another chimed in with a crude comment about how he'd love to spend his whole life with that view. My grip on the phone tightened. Even the friend who had helped her land the job had chimed in with a laughing emoji and a comment that felt just as inappropriate. I couldn't tell who they were talking about, but I didn't like the sound of it. Just as I was about to dig deeper, I heard the water turn off in the bathroom. Quickly, I set the phone back on the nightstand and leaned against the dresser, pretending to look through emails on my own phone. My wife walked out in her robe, drying her hair. "Who was messaging you so early?" I asked casually, testing her reaction. She glanced at her phone and shrugged. "I don't know, probably work stuff." "Why?" "There was some weird conversation in the group chat," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Something about a red dress and other things." Her brows furrowed as she picked up the phone and looked through the messages. "Oh, this," she said, scrolling through. "It's probably about one of the other girls. There was another woman on the trip, and she hooked up with someone there." Maybe they're joking about her. I wasn't entirely convinced. And where were you when all this happened? I pressed. I was texting you from the hotel, she said matter-of-factly. You know that. I wasn't part of whatever they're talking about. Her explanation was plausible, but it didn't fully put me at ease. I let it go for now, though I planned to keep an eye on things. Later, as she unpacked her suitcase, something else caught my attention. A bright red dress with a deep neckline. It looked exactly like what the group chat had been describing. I didn't say anything immediately, not wanting to jump to conclusions. If I confronted her now, she'd likely deny everything, and I'd look foolish if it turned out to be nothing. But the sight of that dress stayed in my mind. Instead, I decided to take a different approach. I remembered her friend, the one who had helped her get the job. We'd talked about grabbing a drink together sometime, and now seemed like the perfect opportunity. If anyone could shed light on what had happened, it would be him. I made a mental note to call him the next day and set up a meeting. For now, I'd keep my suspicions to myself and play it smart. We met at a bar downtown, the kind of place with dim lighting and too many neon beer signs. The guy seemed a little nervous at first, glancing around like he wasn't sure he wanted to be there. I ordered us both a drink and started with casual conversation, keeping the atmosphere light. We talked about work, the weather, and anything else that didn't matter. The goal was to make him feel at ease, and I threw in a few jokes to help break the ice. When I offered to cover the tab, he seemed to relax a little more, which was exactly what I wanted. It didn't take long for the drinks to do their job. The guy wasn't much of a drinker, and it showed. After a couple of rounds, he was leaning forward, laughing louder than necessary, and opening up more than he probably realized. At one point, he looked at me and asked, "What do you do for a living?" I kept my tone casual and replied, "I used to work as a network engineer at Cisco." His eyes lit up as he leaned in closer. "Man, you've got to help me out. My laptop's been acting up, and it's got some really important files on it. If I lose them, I'm screwed." That was the opening I needed. "What's the issue?" I asked, playing along. He explained how some files had disappeared from a program he used for work. It sounded like a basic case of user error, but I didn't let on. Instead, I saw an opportunity to dig deeper. "I'd have to take a look to know for sure," I said. "Why don't we head to your place? I've got time, and it's easier to fix this kind of thing on site." He hesitated for a moment but eventually agreed, too tipsy to think it through. At his apartment, I booted up his laptop and started poking around. As expected, the missing files were in the recycle bin. He must have accidentally moved them there and forgotten about it. I restored them with a couple of clicks but didn't say anything right away. Instead, I turned to him and asked, "By the way, who were you guys talking about in that chat? The one about the big hole or whatever?" His face went pale, and he immediately started stammering. "Oh, that? That's just office jokes," he said, waving it off. "You know how people are. It's nothing serious." I didn't buy it. "Come on," I said, leaning back in the chair. "You're going to have to do better than that. If you don't tell me the truth, I'll delete these files permanently. No backups, no recovery. Your call." He froze, the color draining from his face. "You wouldn't," he said weakly. I raised an eyebrow and hovered the cursor over the delete button. "Try me," I replied. He broke immediately. All right," he said, holding up his hands. "It was your wife. The boss, he's got this thing where he targets female employees on trips. His wife doesn't know, and he spins these stories about being protective and supportive. But the truth is, well, you get the picture. That wasn't all. He went on to explain that the boss kept videos from these trips stored in a private cloud. He even rewards people with access to the footage," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's sick, but nobody says anything because they don't want to lose their jobs." My jaw tightened, but I kept my composure. Where can I find these videos? I asked. He hesitated again but finally gave me a link to the cloud storage. I restored the files on his laptop, stood up, and leaned in close. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, I said quietly, I'll come back here and make sure you regret it. Your laptop? Gone. Your reputation? Toast. Got it? He nodded quickly, too scared to argue. I left his apartment without another word, my mind already focused on the next steps. When I got back home, I made a conscious effort to appear calm and composed. My wife greeted me at the door with her usual cheerful demeanor, and I responded in kind, keeping any trace of tension out of my voice. She asked how the meeting went, and I shrugged casually. It was good, I said. We had a few drinks, talked about work, nothing special. Inside, my mind was racing, but I knew better than to let it show. I needed to handle this carefully. Later that evening, when she was busy in another room, I opened my laptop and began downloading the videos from the link her coworker had given me. Each file confirmed what I'd feared: the boss's so-called hands-on trips were nothing more than a cover for his predatory behavior. As I watched, anger boiled beneath the surface, but I forced myself to stay focused. This wasn't just about me, it was about exposing the truth in a way that couldn't be ignored. As I finished downloading the files, my wife walked back into the room, breaking my train of thought. She asked, "So, how did it go with that guy? Did you learn anything interesting?" I paused for a moment, then decided to use the opportunity to advance my plan. "It went great," I said with a small smile. "Actually, he mentioned something that gave me an idea. Do you happen to have the boss's wife's number?" He was thinking about organizing a surprise gift for the boss and wanted to ask her for advice. She tilted her head, considering my request. "That's interesting," she said. "But I suppose it makes sense. She'd definitely know what he likes. Hold on, let me find it." I watched as she retrieved her phone, scrolling through her contacts. A moment later, she read the number out loud, and I quickly jotted it down. "There you go," she said. "If it's for something nice like that, I'm happy to help." I thanked her and tucked the note away, making a mental note to act on it as soon as possible. Later, I stepped outside for a smoke, using the time to gather my thoughts. With the boss's wife's number in hand, I dialed it and waited as the line rang. When she answered, her tone was cautious, as if she didn't often receive unexpected calls. "Hello, who is this?" she asked. "This is the husband of one of your husband's employees," I began, keeping my tone steady. "I'm sorry to contact you like this, but it's about something important. It involves your husband and my wife, and I need to discuss it with you privately. Please, keep this between us for now." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could tell she was trying to make sense of what I'd just said. "Why would I need to keep this private?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath and replied, "It's sensitive, and it's something you'll want to hear directly from me. I promise I'll explain everything. Can we meet tomorrow, somewhere discreet? A coffee shop near my place, maybe?" She hesitated again, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she let out a sigh. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow at a coffee shop near you. Tell me the address, and I'll be there. But this better not be some kind of trick." I reassured her that it wasn't and gave her the details. As I hung up, I felt a mix of relief and determination. The next step was set, and now it was just a matter of following through. When I arrived at the cafe, the boss's wife was already there, sitting at a corner table, with a coffee in front of her. She looked calm, but there was a hint of tension in her posture. As I approached, she glanced up and gave me a polite nod. "All right," she said, gesturing to the seat across from her. "I'm here. What is this about?" I took a deep breath and sat down, keeping my tone steady. "It's about your husband. He's been unfaithful," I said bluntly, watching her reaction. She didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "I've had my suspicions," she admitted. "He's always traveling, always surrounded by younger women. But suspicions aren't proof. Do you have any evidence? I nodded, prepared for this. It started after a recent work trip, I began. There were messages in a group chat, crude, inappropriate messages. They mentioned a red dress with a plunging neckline and other things. Her expression hardened as she listened. A red dress, she repeated. Your wife was wearing one, wasn't she? I confirmed it. Yes. And from what I've learned, you didn't attend that trip because your husband told you to stay behind. Does that sound right? She nodded slowly, her suspicions clearly deepening. I've seen photos of that trip, she said. I saw your wife in that dress, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. It doesn't stop there. One of the guys at the office confirmed that your husband slept with my wife during that trip. And it's not just her. He's been using these trips as opportunities to prey on female employees. There's more, something you need to see. She raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt as I pulled out my phone. I opened the folder with the videos I'd downloaded and placed the phone on the table, turning the screen toward her. As she watched, her face went pale. Each clip was damning, showing her husband's actions in vivid detail. She covered her mouth with her hand, her composure slipping for the first time. That bastard, she muttered under her breath. He's been lying to me this whole time. She sat back in her chair, taking a moment to compose herself before speaking again. This is unbelievable, she said. But it explains so much. He's going to pay for this. I'll make sure of it. I nodded. I thought you deserved to know, I said. You're the only one who can hold him accountable at the company level. If you need any help, I'm willing to provide it. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. I'm calling the corporate office, she said firmly. They need to know exactly what kind of person he is. We'll deal with this together. I sat back as she had a brief but intense conversation with someone on the other end, detailing the situation and arranging for a formal report to be submitted. Once the call ended, we worked together to draft an email, attaching the videos as evidence. When it was done, she leaned back in her chair, letting out a long sigh. Thank you for bringing this to me, she said, her voice steady but tinged with anger. It's not easy to hear, but it's better to know the truth. He's going to get what's coming to him. I nodded, standing up as she did the same. We shook hands, a mutual understanding passing between us. Good luck, I said as we parted ways. She gave me a faint smile, her determination clear. And thank you. You've done the right thing. With that, we went our separate ways, both knowing this was far from over. The morning began with shouting, jarring me awake. My wife's voice carried through the house, full of disbelief and anger. I stumbled out of bed to find her pacing the living room, her phone in hand. What's going on? I asked, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. She turned to me, her face flushed with frustration. The boss got fired, she said. And not just him, a bunch of women from the office were let go too. This is insane. They can't do this. Fired? I repeated, trying to process the information. Why? What happened? She shook her head, still pacing. I don't know the full story yet, but it's obvious someone set him up. There's no way this is fair. He didn't deserve this, and neither did the others. It's just wrong. I watched her closely, noting the intensity of her reaction. Something about it struck me as off. Do you think it has anything to do with the big hole? I asked, keeping my tone steady. She stopped mid-step and turned to face me, her expression shifting from confusion to suspicion. What did you just say? She demanded. I took a deep breath and crossed my arms. You heard me. The big hole. That's what they called you in the group chat, isn't it? Her face went pale as the weight of my words sank in. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice trembling. I didn't bother explaining. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened the folder with the videos, and handed it to her. See for yourself, I said. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the phone, before finally taking it. As she watched, her expression shifted from shock to anger. You had no right to go digging into this, she snapped, slamming the phone down on the table. This was none of your business. You shouldn't have gotten involved. I laughed bitterly at her attempt to deflect. None of my business? I repeated. You cheated on me with your boss, and you have the nerve to tell me it's none of my business. Well, guess what? I made it my business. That's why he got fired. His wife and I made sure of it. Her anger turned to panic as the reality of the situation hit her. You did this, she asked, her voice shaking. I nodded, my expression cold. Yeah. I did. And I'd do it again. He deserved it, and so did you. She started shouting, her voice rising to a shrill pitch as she accused me of ruining her career, her life, and everything in between. I didn't flinch. Her words had no effect on me anymore. Without a word, I walked past her to the bedroom and grabbed a suitcase. What are you doing? She demanded, following me. I didn't answer. Instead, I began packing her things, tossing clothes and belongings into the suitcase without care. She tried to stop me, grabbing at my arms, but I brushed her off easily. You can't do this, she cried. This is my house too. Not anymore, I said firmly, zipping up the suitcase. I carried it to the front door and opened it, setting the suitcase on the porch. Get out, I said. We're done. You can stay wherever you want, but you're not staying here. She stood there, stunned, as I turned and began gathering the rest of her things. By the time I'd finished, she was still there, tears streaming down her face, but I felt nothing. With one final trip, I placed the last of her belongings outside and closed the door behind her. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the house was quiet. I leaned against the door and let out a deep breath, knowing that this chapter was finally over. The divorce process started almost immediately after she left the house. I wasted no time contacting a lawyer, gathering all the necessary documentation, and setting the wheels in motion. She, on the other hand, didn't take it as gracefully. Within days, I was served papers with accusations claiming I was controlling and emotionally abusive. It was laughable, but I knew it was a tactic to try and salvage her reputation or perhaps to gain leverage. I wasn't worried. The truth was on my side. The court proceedings were straightforward. My lawyer presented the evidence, the videos, the messages, and the circumstances surrounding her infidelity. Her accusations didn't hold water against the solid proof I had. She tried to play the victim, shedding tears and spinning stories, but the judge wasn't swayed. It became clear to everyone in the room that her claims were baseless. The ruling came swiftly in my favor, and I walked out of that courtroom feeling a sense of closure. Once the divorce was finalized, I decided it was time for a fresh start. I sold the house we'd shared and found a new place, far from the memories of our time together. The new house wasn't anything extravagant, but it was mine, a symbol of my independence and a clean slate. Moving in was cathartic. Each piece of furniture I chose and each box I unpacked felt like reclaiming my life, one step at a time. Life settled into a peaceful routine. I focused on work, hobbies, and reconnecting with friends I'd neglected during the turbulent years of my marriage. The quiet was welcome, a stark contrast to the chaos she'd brought into my life. For the first time in a long while, I felt like myself again. The scars were there, but they no longer hurt. They were reminders of lessons learned and strength gained. Then one evening, months after everything had settled, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find her standing there, looking worn and desperate. Her face carried traces of regret, and her voice was hesitant as she spoke. I made a mistake, she said. I've been thinking about everything, and I want to fix things between us. I stared at her for a moment, incredulous. The audacity was almost comical. You want to fix things? I asked, keeping my voice steady. After everything you did? After you dragged my name through the mud in court, cheated, and lied? You think you can just show up here and erase all that? She stammered, trying to find the right words, but I cut her off. There's nothing left to fix. You burned it all down, and I've moved on. Her tone shifted to pleading. Please, she said. I know I messed up, but I've changed. We can start over. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head, unmoved by her theatrics. Starting over isn't an option, I said. Not with you. You need to leave. She hesitated, looking as though she might argue, but the resolve in my voice left no room for negotiation. I stepped back into the house and closed the door firmly. As the lock clicked into place, I said loud enough for her to hear through the door, "Go to hell." Turning away, I felt a sense of finality. The chapter was closed, and I wasn't looking back.